Hi again. Continuing the series on the Rhodesian Bush War, and among the units that were prominent was the second Special Forces unit to be formed, the first being the SAS, which was the Selous Scouts. And the Selous Scouts were formed after some experiments conducted by the Army and the Special Branch, and some of these were in conjunction with each other, into what was called pseudo gangs. And the concept of pseudo gangs was had been used in other parts of the British Empire, notably Kenya, and the idea was to form a gang of what would appear to be terrorists and infiltrate them into an area so they could link up with the real terrorists and then eliminate them. And the experiments had been done using experts from the who knew indigenous cultures and tracking and bush life and so on. And there were several from the SAS involved in this, notably a chap called Andre Rabi. But he had been killed while conducting pseudo operation training when there was a map reading error, and he was shot by the security forces who thought he was a terrorist. He was carrying an AK-47. So the lesson learned was they really had to delineate the areas of operation if the pseudos were operating in an area. And the terminology they used was frozen areas. So the security forces weren't allowed to operate. So what's now usually known as tactical out of bounds. So the officer chosen to stand up this unit and lead it was Reid Daly, who had served in C Squadron, the SAS in Malaya. He had been the RSM of the Rhodesian Light Infantry and then been commissioned and had been running support commando. And General Walls approached him and asked him to stand up this new regiment, which was going to be top secret for clandestine operations. So after some hesitation, he agreed to do it and started putting the pieces together. And the first time I went to Rhodesia was 1976, and there was very little known about the Selous Scouts, but they had recently hit the headlines with a raid into a major terrorist camp on the Pungwe River, where they actually killed, I think it was 1,100 terrorists by using this flying column disguised as Frelimo. So everyone was talking about this unit, the Selous Scouts, and the flying columns, which was later the assault troop, and tracking, which they talked about in they did like a TV news item on the Selous Scouts, and it was all about tracking. Disguised the real role, which was the pseudo operations, which was the secretive stuff. Anyway, in 1984, a book was produced, which is this one, Selous Scouts Top Secret War, by Lieutenant Colonel Reid Daly and Peter Stiff, who I've mentioned before. Back cover. And I picked it up. I used to go to a bookshop in London when I was working down there called Motor Books, just off Leicester Square, and they specialised in aviation, military firearms, and motors and things like that. And that was the first time I saw this book. But the guy who ran it, he operated the shop like it was his own private library, and he was very reluctant to sell you a book. And I think in fact, it was on my next trip to South Africa that I actually picked it up, picked up a copy of it. Anyway, it's very detailed, and it goes into the story I just mentioned about how the unit was started and so on. One of the things they talk about was the recruitment and selection. Now, the thing about the pseudo gang concept was that you had to use African troops. And Reid Daly had never worked with African troops before because the RLI and the SAS were both all-white units, and the Rhodesian African Rifles was the African unit. And so he had to kind of poach guys from there and also get them from other sources, direct recruitment. And also, and this was the really interesting thing, they used turned terrorists. They would capture terrorists and turn them and persuade them to fight for the Rhodesians. And if they agreed to do this, generally speaking, they stayed turned. I think there was one case ever that a guy reverted back. And I once asked a chap from the Selous Scouts how long this process was, and he said it usually took a bit of time. He said, but it could be really quick. He said, we've captured a guy in a contact and turned him immediately, and he starts pointing his mates out straight away. So it was very interesting thing. So they had to recruit a large number. In fact, the majority of people in the Selous Scouts were African, and they needed to have them trained in a particular way. So some of them already had military training, but they kind of had to demilitarize it as well. So they had this selection process, which was not really based on the SAS one. They were looking for a different type of individual. It was quite a long process, and it started off. They got all the candidates together at the barracks in Nkomo, which was later renamed Andre Rabi Barracks in honor of the soldier who was killed. And they would get them together, and then they would put them into coaches and take them up to Kariba, where the training area was. But they would drop them off something like 25k from the destination, and they had to all the kit they brought with them, and they were given just go down that road until you're told to stop, and they weren't told time, so they had to go as fast as they thought they could do it. And that was, and I've been in the Zambezi Valley, and I can't imagine tabbing for 25 kilo in it. It's a terrible, hot, humid place, and that was the start to it. And the training camp was called Wafa Wafa, which in Mashona means now you are dead. And the one of the facets of Selous Scouts selection, which was fairly unique, was that they starved the guys. I've spoken to experts on physical training who say you can't do it, you just can't perform with no calories, but they made them do it. Anyway, so after that, the survivors and the guys who passed through this very arduous ordeal went into what was called the dark phase, where they would be trained to be able to infiltrate terrorists. So it was a terrific process. The book talks about all the major operations. As some of the names have been changed, some of the faces obliterated, because at the time some of them are still operating in South Africa and so on. The African soldiers, most of their names in this book were changed because they didn't want them to be targeted by Mugabe's regime afterwards. Those who stayed in Rhodesia. Like the SAS, it was a bit of a foreign legion. There were Brits, Americans in the Scouts, and they did a lot of different things, a lot of different roles, which we'll be talking about in other of these videos. So terrifically interesting. Then in, I think it was quite a few years later, this book came out, Pamwe, which is The Legend of the Selous Scouts by Reid Daly. And it's basically the same book with a bit of added material. Some of the names have been revealed, some of the operational details and the photos and so on, because by this time the winds of change in Africa had made it possible. And it's another look at the story. Unfortunately, Peter Stiff had the rights to the story, and he put an injunction against Reid or the publishers, and the book was withdrawn. So I was lucky to get a copy, and it's autographed. So it's a really valuable book, and I keep it in my safe. So it tells the story. It complements the first book, and it's an inside view. Reid Daly went from major to lieutenant colonel, and towards the end, he was investigated, or the unit was investigated for poaching and selling ivory and things by the Army's investigation branch. And one of the things they did was tap the phones, the unit phones, and the charges were unfounded, but it was reckoned that there were leaks because sensitive stuff was discussed on the phones, and some operational details may have been leaked to the enemy. So Reid Daly had a flaming row with General Hickman, the army commander, and he was reprimanded, and he decided to leave. So that was really the end. And then not too long after, Pat Armstrong took over, but then not too long after, everything wrapped up anyway. After the elections in Rhodesia, quite a few of the guys moved down south, and there was the idea of forming a unit specifically down there, but then they were absorbed into what became 5 Recce of the South African Special Forces to continue basically the pseudo role and some of the other stuff the Scouts did. So really good look at a very, very unique and significant unit. Now, some of the things that are in the book, such as the way they trained the African soldiers to do amazing things that they hadn't been allowed to do before, such as free fall parachuting and things, we will be talking about it when we come to other books on the subject. So they were the first book was open the curtains on this unit, and as such it stands as a milestone.